A couple of videos ago, we asked the only question in life that really matters. Do you need a metal guitar to play metal? And what we concluded was that need is a very big word, but it's kind of like those signs that you see in offices that say, you don't have to be crazy to work here, but it helps. Side note, people who put up signs like that in offices are the reason I stopped working in offices. But one of the things we did talk about was that the more gain you use, the less it matters what pickup, and by extension, what guitar you use. So the next logical step is to look at the source of the gain, which leads us to the next question in life that really matters. Do you need a metal amp to play metal? You can refer back to my other video for an explanation of what we mean when we say metal. But what we need to do here is specify what we mean by a metal amp. I'm going to start with a caveat here, which is that a lot of professional metal guitarists don't use amps at all. Or at least a lot of the time they use amp modelers like the Line 6 Helix or the Fractal Axe effects. Or they use profilers like the Kemper or the Neural DSP Quad Cortex. Or they use plugins like Amplitube or Guitar Rig. We can get into those more in depth in another video, but what appeals to professionals about those kinds of processes is the degree of precise control they offer over the tonal characteristics of the amplified sound. And this is what interests us, because the question of do you need any kind of amp to play any kind of music really implies that what you're looking for is a high degree of control over your guitar sound. And we're not going to waste anyone's time by plugging in a little Tweed combo or a Roland Jazz chorus or anything like that. It goes without saying that you can try to play metal with those kinds of amps, and best of luck to you if you do. But for this video to be as useful as possible, what I want to do is compare two amps that people routinely have used and do still use to play metal. The first is the Marshall 1987 reissue, which is a 50-watt Plexi. As its name doesn't suggest, it's actually a design from the early 70s. It's a single-channel, non-master volume amplifier, although this one has had a master volume mod so it can be pushed into overdrive at manageable volumes. So the presence pot is now the master volume and the actual presence has been moved to the rear. You can also jump the normal and high treble inputs to get more saturation, which is how we're running it here. The second amp is the Victory VX Kraken. It's also a 50-watt amp, but unlike the Marshall, it not only has two channels, but also two master volumes. It was designed by Victory with the input of Rabia Masad, who is a very well-reputed prog metal guitar player. The first channel is based on a Marshall JCM 800, and the second one is based on a PV5150, so you know this is an amp that gets very aggressive very quickly. So while the Marshall Plexi has been used by metal players, it's still very much an old-school design from an era when the heaviest bands around were what we would now refer to as classic rock. The Kraken, on the other hand, has a solid modern metal pedigree. We're not reviewing the amps on their own merits here. We're looking at how well suited they are to doing one specific thing. And if you do that specific thing, which of them you might want to use. So we're going to hear them in a track, one after the other, and I'm going to set them up to be, in my view, as close as I can get them to the appropriate sound. Both amps are plugged into the Marshall SC100 load box, and I'm using the cab section of the Neural DSP Archetype Nolly. The guitars I'm using are, for the rhythms, this Ibanez RGIF7 with EMG 808X pickups, and for the leads, I'm using this Ibanez RG921 with Bare Knuckle War Pigs. I'm sure you'll agree, guitars don't get much more metal than this. Last thing is, what a lot of guys do is they put an overdrive pedal in front of the amp, something like a tube screamer, to tighten up the low end and give it a little mid-range push. That's a perfectly valid technique, but we're going to give it a miss right now because what really interests us is to see how much we can get out of the amps on their own. So first, let's have a listen to the Marshall. First of all, I want to show you the settings I've used to get these tones because they're pretty extreme. I've basically dimed the high treble input, the treble, and the presence. I've also got the mids and the master volume most of the way up. Meanwhile, I've got the normal volume pretty low and I've rolled the bass completely off. I've had to do this to get as much gain out of the amp as possible while keeping the sound as tight as possible. But despite this, we still don't have a massively saturated sound and it's still a bit dark and woolly. The tone is better for the lead parts, but we're lacking sustain. These would be great tones for a kind of doom stoner sound, but for modern metal we're definitely not there yet. Now let's check out the Kraken. Okay, so this is a completely different beast, pun very much intended. There's a lot more gain on tap, and so a lot more compression and sustain, but it's also clearer and more articulate because the bass end is a lot tighter and the mid-range is a lot more present. This is what you get with an amp that's been voiced for modern metal. If you look at the settings, the EQ is pretty much straight up the middle with only minor tweaks, and all I've done is turn up the gain and the master volume until I got the sound I wanted. All the guitars were recorded with the same sound, which is gain 2 at just over 50%, which is quite a lot of gain, but the sound doesn't get mushy or boomy or fizzy or dark. Where I mentioned about using a tube screamer type pedal in the front end, we know that if I were to put one in front of the Marshall, it would add more gain and tighten up the sound in a way that would get us way closer to the modern metal sound we're looking for. But we're not going to do that because we're comparing these two amps, and my whole point is that the Kraken doesn't need it. In fact, there are very few amps that wouldn't get closer to a metal tone if you put a mid-heavy overdrive in front of them and played them aggressively. But that doesn't mean that every amp is suitable to play metal. And it's important to remember that effects pedals exist in the first place because guitarists felt like they weren't getting as much as they wanted out of amplifiers like the Plexi. They were too bassy and they had too much headroom, so they didn't break up soon enough or clearly enough, and that's why the treble booster was invented. And overdrives and fuzz pedals, these things were created because guitarists felt like their single-channel, non-master volume amplifiers didn't sound nasty enough on their own. So yes, people did use Plexis to play metal, but again, the kind of metal we're talking about was played by guys who have been drawing their pensions for a good few years now. Here's the thing about vintage gear, or vintage style gear. Guitar gear from the 50s and 60s has a tremendous amount of mystique about it. And that's not just because the guitars and amps themselves look very cool, although they do. It's also because the guys that we mean when we talk about guitar gods were using and still use that kind of gear. And just like any red-blooded guitar nerd, when I daydream about amps, it's Dumbles and Fender Tweeds and Two Rocks and yes, Marshall Plexis that I'm daydreaming about. But the reality is that I play in a prog metal band, and when we get heavy, I need to bring the noise in such a way that those amps are just not designed to deliver. When I bought the Kraken, the other amp I was looking at was a Dr. Z Maz 38. And while that's undeniably a very cool amp, it would kind of be like off-roading in a muscle car. I'd look cool while I was doing it, but I'd still end up stuck in the mud. And that, as we say, is the ball game. I'm going to say what I always say here, which is that there aren't any rules, and you can in fact do whatever the hell you want with any gear you want. And of course, a lot of you don't have the resources to be buying this or that piece of gear, and you absolutely shouldn't let that hold you back from playing the music that you want to play, guitar tone be damned. But for that same reason, if you do have the means to get the right tool for the job, that's absolutely what you need to do. Because time spent fighting with your gear to squeeze the tone you want out of it is time not spent playing the music that you want to play. And all things considered, that's the only thing that really matters. As always, thank you so much for watching my video, and I hope to see you next time.